Hi everyone, tonight we're going to begin with a snowflake. Just one. Floating past a frosted window, catching a flicker of Christmas lights as it drifts silently toward a sidewalk. Inside the house behind that glass, a woman my age, 62, cardigans, soft slippers, 2 sizes too big, is pouring tea into a chipped mug. She's not lonely exactly, just not invited. You might think being left out of a holiday gathering isn't that serious. Families have disagreements, right? But what if the people who uninvited you were your son and his wife? What if they looked you in the eye and said you didn't fit in with the guests? What if the table you'd once dreamed of filling with laughter and grandkids didn't have a chair for you anymore? So before you feel like that snowflake adrift dismissed, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And don't forget to comment below with your location and what time it is where you're watching from. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. We think it would be best if you skipped Christmas this year. Harper didn't blink when she said it. Her voice was as frosty as the rim of the champagne flute in her hand. Ryan and I will be at his in-laws. It's mostly a professional crowd, she added, as if I were the bartender at the wrong fundraiser. And honestly, Elaine, you just don't really fit in. There it was, a 6-word sentence that cracked 34 years of motherhood wide open. Now, to be fair, this wasn't the first time Harper had said something sharp with a smile. It wasn't even the first time I'd been left out. But it was the first time I heard the subtext so loudly. You're not one of us. You're inconvenient. I managed a polite nod, and of course, the same way I always did. But the second I got home and closed the door behind me, the air inside my house felt different, heavier. Like the walls themselves were judging me for giving up my retirement savings to buy people a life that no longer had room for me. There's an old saying, family is a blessing. But sometimes I think it should come with a warning label, like may cause emotional side effects, including but not limited to disappointment, guilt, and long-term financial ruin. I sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at the laminated placemat I'd had since Mark was alive. My late husband used to joke that I'd never throw it away until it cracked in half, and even then I'd try taping it. He always knew how to make me laugh. Even when we couldn't afford much, Mark made our little house in Millbrook feel like the richest place on earth. It's where we raised Ryan. It's where I stayed when Mark passed from a heart attack 18 years ago. And it's the home I nearly sold, because my son asked me to. I remember that day so vividly. You should think about selling, Ryan said just a month after the funeral. It's too much house for you. And the money would really help with tuition. I felt like he'd slapped me. Not because he was wrong necessarily, but because he was our everything. That house held birthday parties, emergency breathing treatments, homework nights, and the laugh track of 1,000 inside jokes between father and son. And now, the only one left was me. Still, I said no. Of course I did. I picked up extra shifts instead, overnight ones that most people avoided like the plague. Because I wanted my son to have the future we never had. Because mothers do that. But here's the thing, no one tells you about sacrifice. If you do it silently long enough, people will forget you're sacrificing at all. Fast forward 15 years. Ryan's married to Harper, a woman whose hobbies include silent judgment and luxury furniture. Their house, a 5-bedroom colonial in an exclusive cul-de-sac, with neighbours who host wine tastings for their labradoodles. And how did they afford it? Well, partially because their real estate fairy godmother was named Elaine Bennett. That's me, by the way. I'm Elaine, 62 years old, nurse, widow, mother, mortgage co-signer, and now, apparently an unwanted holiday guest. You know, earlier that same week before the Christmas snub, I had paid the December mortgage on their house. $3,486. That's how much. I know because it took me 3 shifts and skipping groceries to make it happen. And yet I didn't fit in. I wasn't looking for applause. I wasn't even looking for a thank you, but I had hoped for a chair at the table. Maybe even a little slice of dry turkey and someone asking how I was doing. Spoiler alert, no one asked. After Harper's little speech, I went home and made myself a bowl of instant oatmeal. I sat by the window, the same one I used to decorate with Ryan when he was little. We used to tape paper snowflakes to it and count how many icicles formed overnight. That night, I counted 3 tears on my cheek before I even realized I was crying. There's a term in academic circles called social displacement theory. It's the idea that when new bonds form like marriage or status-driven relationships, old ones get pushed out, not necessarily because they're broken, but because they're no longer seen as necessary. And I think that's exactly what happened to me. I didn't stop being a good mother. I just stopped being useful. But as I stared at the blinking lights across the street, something else blinked awake inside me. It was faint, like the flicker of a pilot light under a long neglected stove. But it was there, a thought, a possibility. If I wasn't family enough to sit at their table, maybe I wasn't obligated to keep putting the food on it either. The snow didn't stick that night, but the idea did. By morning, I was still thinking about it, this possibility that I could stop. Not stop loving Ryan. God, no. But stop being his emergency fund, his last resort, his personal bank that never charged overdraft fees. It felt scandalous, just entertaining the thought. Like I was betraying the sacred, invisible contract that said mothers give, sons receive, forever. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and stared out at the same cracked backyard fence Mark had always meant to fix. And that's when I started remembering who I was before I became a cautionary tale in a luxury zip code. My name is Elaine Bennett. I was born in 1961 in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town so small we still argue about which diner has the better pie. For the record, it's Millie's, and I will not be debating this further. I was a straight-A student class secretary, and I met Mark, my husband, of 23 years, when I slipped on a wet floor at St. Jude's and accidentally flung a tray of mashed potatoes across the cafeteria. He caught the tray. I caught feelings. Mark was quiet, the kind of guy who could read an entire newspaper without commenting once. But he had a dry wit that crept up on you like a slow grin. He became a hospital administrator. I became a nurse. Our lives were scheduled in 12-hour increments, full of clunky pager beeps, emergency C-sections, and vending machine dinners. But we loved it, and we loved Ryan most of all. Ryan was a miracle baby. We were told we couldn't have kids after years of trying. Then one day, there he was, tiny, wheezing, and red as a chili pepper, thanks to his underdeveloped lungs. We spent most of his first year in and out of pediatric wings. I remember holding him at night, propped up so he could breathe easier, whispering lullabies I barely knew the words to. There's an old Filipino proverb that goes, "The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth." But what happens when the child is embraced, given everything? Do they eventually feel smothered, entitled, or just forget who held the oxygen mask when they were 3? Ryan thrived. Asthma turned from a life-threatening diagnosis into a manageable inconvenience. By high school, he was the boy with a laptop instead of a skateboard building websites in our basement and ordering pizza using promo codes he found through hacking. Mark and I saved every spare penny for his education, opting for used cars and DIY Christmases. Then Mark died. It happened on a Tuesday. A heart attack, sudden and ruthless. I still remember the taste of the cafeteria soup I was eating when they paged me. Ryan was 20 then. Sophomore year of college. He hugged me at the funeral and said, "I'll take care of you, Mum." I remember thinking how proud Mark would have been, but pride doesn't pay the mortgage. The life insurance barely covered the funeral and leftover hospital bills. I didn't tell Ryan how close I came to losing the house. I just picked up more shifts. By then, my body had learned how to survive on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee. One night, maybe a month after the funeral, Ryan sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, you should really sell this place." He didn't mean it cruelly. He just meant it practically. That's how he processes things, data-driven, like a spreadsheet that doesn't factor in grief. I laughed, though I wanted to cry. "Where would you stay during summer break?" I asked. "Besides, this house has good bones." He shrugged and went back to whatever app he was building. I remember watching him then, how grown he looked, how distant. Like I'd just walked into a season of my life I hadn't auditioned for. Over the next 3 years, I worked, and worked, and worked. Some shifts were so long I forgot what day it was. Once I took a nap on a gurney in the supply closet. I told myself it was temporary, just until Ryan graduated. When he finally did, he hugged me and said I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. And I believed him. For a while. Ryan got a job right here in Millbrook. Harper entered the picture not long after. She was everything I wasn't: polished, poised, practiced in the art of saying I'm fine through clenched teeth. The first time he brought her home, she looked around my living room like it was a dentist's waiting area. "Your home is quaint," she said, eyes scanning the wallpaper like it offended her on a molecular level. I smiled. "Thank you. It's been through a lot with us." She made a noise that could have been agreement, or a cough, or a judgmental sneeze. That night I told Ryan she's lovely and meant it, sort of. But something had shifted. I just didn't know it yet. It's funny, isn't it? How hindsight always knows when the earthquake started. How you can trace the cracks in the wall back to one single trembly moment when someone said, "You should really sell this place." I didn't. I couldn't. But maybe I was finally ready to stop selling myself short. The first time Harper called me Elaine instead of Mrs. Bennett, it was during a brunch at their apartment. She handed me a mimosa without making eye contact and said, "Elaine, would you mind sitting on the stool? The table's already full." That was the first time I ate off my lap at a meal I helped pay for. It didn't start like that. At first, Harper seemed like the dream partner for Ryan, confident, articulate, dressed like she was always headed to a charity auction. She worked in PR for a boutique marketing firm and carried herself like someone who knew where the linen napkins were at all times. And I'll admit I tried. I wore nicer blouses when I visited, bought Harper scented candles for her birthday, even pretended I liked the organic green smoothies she insisted were cleansing. Spoiler, they tasted like a lawnmower, but none of it mattered. I could feel her measuring me always with that same unblinking calm. She didn't correct me when I called her sweetheart once, but she did blink 3 times in a row, which I now realize was her version of a warning shot. When they got engaged, Ryan called me from their shared apartment. She said yes, he beamed. I clapped, heart swelling despite my hesitation. "Oh, honey, I'm so happy for you." He hesitated. "Harper's parents are helping with the wedding. They've already booked the venue. It's going to be at the Ashcroft Country Club." My hand froze mid-air, a spoonful of soup going cold. The Ashcroft. Let me explain. The Ashcroft isn't where people like me go. It's where people who own hospitals go, where the chairs are heavier than my mortgage payment and they serve butter in tiny gold-plated dishes. I once went there for a retirement dinner, spent the entire evening apologizing to the silverware for using the wrong fork. "That's fancy," I said finally. "Yeah, but it's all taken care of. Harper's dad knows the owner. We don't want you worrying about anything, okay?" That should have been my first clue. Because we don't want you worrying about anything. In wedding speak, often translates to, "We don't want you involved in anything." Sure enough, when I met Harper's mother, Simone, at the first planning brunch, she greeted me with a powdered cheek air kiss and said, "Elaine, I hear you're in medicine. How useful." She said useful the same way someone says durable about a pair of shoes they wouldn't wear outside. Over smoked salmon, and words I had to Google later like tablescape. Simone went through their wedding vision with the kind of military precision typically reserved for submarine missions. "We've chosen ivory and sage as the color palette. There will be a violin quartet during cocktail hour, followed by a 7-course seated dinner. Oh, I said. That sounds wonderful. Simone tilted her head. Now, I know you're probably not used to this scale of event, but don't worry, everything's been arranged. I didn't know whether to thank her or ask for a permission slip. When I asked about the rehearsal dinner, something I thought I might contribute to, Simone blinked. Oh, we've booked Le Marseillaise? Thomas, my husband, plays tennis with the owner? I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Is there anything I can help with? Harper, who had been silently flipping through fabric swatches, looked up and said, Maybe you could help assemble the favor boxes. We're doing artisanal honey jars with monogrammed ribbon. Very hands-on. Very hands-on. Very grandmother in the corner energy. So I smiled and said, Of course. And that's exactly what I did. I hot-glued tiny tags onto tiny jars in my living room at 2 a.m. for people I would later overhear call me the sweet woman who helped with the setup. The wedding was exactly what you'd imagine from a couple featured in a lifestyle magazine, 7 bridesmaids in dresses that probably cost more than my mortgage, a harpist playing Coldplay during the procession, and an open bar with a signature cocktail called the Harper. It had elderflower liqueur. I had Pepto in my purse. Ryan looked radiant. That's the only word for it. I kept staring at him, my boy in a tailored suit, smiling like the world had finally stopped trying to outpace him. And yet, I was background noise. Seated at a table near the kitchen, I watched Harper's family hold court in the center. Every toast, every spotlight, every camera flash revolved around them. Ryan came by my table once, just long enough to kiss my cheek and say, Having fun, Mum. Of course I lied. It's all beautiful. I'm so happy for you. He smiled already, turning to rejoin the party. That night when I got home, I kicked off my shoes, sat on my creaky couch, and let the silence settle around me like an itchy blanket. There's a concept in psychology called emotional labor. It's all the invisible work we do to keep others comfortable. Smiling when we want to scream, helping when we want to say no. Standing quietly on the sidelines of a life we built just to make sure someone else's moment shines brighter. And that night, I realized something. I was exhausted. But I wasn't just tired from the wedding or the travel or the budget-stretching dress I bought. I was tired from shrinking, from making myself small enough to fit inside their perfect picture frame. Harper's parents were wealthy. That wasn't the issue. The issue was, they were never going to make room for me in that world. And worse, Ryan didn't even notice. He thought his mother would always be there, humming along in the background, like the bass line of a song he'd long since stopped hearing. But something in me was starting to hum louder, and I had a feeling that song was about to change. They invited me to see the new house the following month. I say invited, but really it was more of a formality. A come-see-where-your-money's-going tour, only nobody mentioned that part out loud. Lakewood Estates. Just saying the name makes you feel like your car needs to be washed. It's one of those gated communities where the street names all sound like overpriced candles, Whispering Birch, Lavender Hollow, Silver Meadow. The kind of neighborhood where the houses don't just have garages, they have his and hers, garages with epoxy floors and lighting that could land a plane. Their house was the third one on the left, past a fountain that misted softly into the air like it had something to hide. 4 bedrooms, wraparound porch, a gourmet kitchen that looked like it had never seen a real meal, and a view of the lake that shimmered so perfectly I half expected to see swans doing synchronized laps. Isn't it perfect? Ryan beamed. It's beautiful, I replied though. My stomach was already clenching. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a condo, a starter home, something within reach of a young couple still building their lives. Not this open-concept cathedral to their Pinterest dreams. Harper floated in behind us, wearing a pale cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my washer. The backsplash is imported from Tuscany, she offered, like she was describing her lineage. It's very elegant, I said. We got a great deal. Ryan added quickly, already anticipating the question. And Harper's parents are helping with the down payment. I nodded, smiling tightly. Of course they were. But what I didn't know then, what no one said during that tour where I praised crown molding and nodded politely at recessed lighting, was that soon I would be helping too, in ways I couldn't afford. The first call came 3 weeks after they moved in. "Hey, Mom." Ryan started, and right away I knew. The tone. That subtle layering of charm over tension, like wrapping a phone call in bubble wrap. "We're in a bit of a tight spot." I sat down. That's something you learn as you get older. If someone under 40 says tight spot, you sit down. It's just some early expenses we didn't plan for. The property taxes were higher than expected. And, we had to replace Harper's car unexpectedly. The dealership really stiffed us on her trade-in. How much I asked. No hesitation, no guilt trip, just instinct. 5,000 would get us through this month. I wish I could say I paused, asked for receipts, offered a financial planner instead, but I didn't. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it, and said, "Okay." The money left my account the next morning. That 5,000. It was supposed to go toward a modest condo I'd been eyeing near the hospital. 1 floor, no stairs, just me, a tea kettle, and a garden I didn't have to share. But Ryan needed it. So I shelved the dream and picked up 2 extra weekend shifts. That one-time favor became quarterly, then monthly, then routine. There was the time the air conditioning broke. It's practically life or death in this heat, Mum. The time Harper lost her job. She needs certifications courses, career investments. The time the hardwood floors weren't the right tone and had to be replaced. Each time the story was different, but the result was the same. I'd work a little more, eat a little less, and wire the money by Friday. Here's a weird fact. In Iceland, there's a word for the feeling of something familiar becoming unbearable over time. It's ennui, but with snow and existential dread. That's what this began to feel like. At work, I started skipping the cafeteria and packing peanut butter sandwiches. I stopped going to the movies, stopped replacing my worn-out sneakers. My bathtub started leaking, and I duct-taped the faucet instead of calling a plumber. But the payments kept going. Because if you've ever loved someone hard enough to ignore your own pain, you know it's easier to break your own back than to watch someone else stumble. Until it isn't. One Sunday, I went to their house for dinner, the kind of visit that used to happen weekly, but by then had become when we can squeeze you in. I brought a pie store-bought because I'd worked a double and couldn't feel my ankles. Their house smelled like one of those boutiques that sells throw pillows for $80. New furniture everywhere. An enormous sectional that looked like it had never known a potato chip. Polished fixtures. A coffee table so fancy I was scared to set anything down on it. "This is beautiful," I said, gesturing at the new setup. Harper, perched on the sectional like a cat in a museum, replied, "We decided to treat ourselves. Self-care, you know." I bit the inside of my cheek. Self-care. Right. I had just eaten instant noodles 3 nights in a row, but yes, let's all practice radical softness. Then I heard her in the kitchen. I had excused myself to use the bathroom and caught part of her phone call. "I know, Mom. It's exhausting, including her in everything. But Ryan still feels obligated. At least she helps out financially." Helps out. I was paying their mortgage. I had skipped my flu shot to make this month's installment. And to her, I was just some obligation. That night, I drove home in silence. Not even the radio could fill the space between the reality I'd accepted and the one that had been handed to me in Harper's flat, dismissive voice. There's a saying in geriatric care. If you feel invisible, check your pulse. You're probably still alive, just in someone else's story. And that's what I had become. A side character, a utility. But my story, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The pneumonia hit 2 days before Thanksgiving. I'd been pushing through a stubborn cough for weeks, blaming the weather, the hospital air, the endless shifts. It wasn't until I found myself gripping the edge of the nurse's station, gasping after changing a patient's IV, that someone finally intervened. Elaine, Dr. Marshall said, narrowing his eyes. You look like a ghost. When's the last time you took a day off? I laughed, which turned into a wheezing fit. Does a lunch break count? He didn't smile. He just walked me straight to radiology. The diagnosis wasn't shocking. Pneumonia. Not mild. Complicated by fatigue and what the doctor called chronic physiological stress. In layman's terms, I'd been working myself into the ground, and my body finally decided to press the emergency stop button. You're not going back on the floor, Dr. Marshall said. You're going home. Full medical leave. 4 weeks minimum. I blinked at him. I have responsibilities. And I have a medical license, he replied. Go. Rest. Heal. So I did. Well, I tried. But when you've been running on caffeine and obligation for a decade, slowing down feels unnatural. Like the world is moving without you. Like you're not earning your right to exist. Still that night, I settled into my recliner with tea and a quilt. Rain tapped at the windows, soft and rhythmic. And for the first time in months, I let myself sit still. No pager, no financial spreadsheets, no Harper in my ear making veiled jabs about generational differences. Then I remembered their mortgage. The next payment was due in 2 weeks. And I didn't have it, not without working, not without raiding what little was left in my emergency fund, my backup for dental work, home repairs, maybe one short vacation before arthritis turned me into a human question mark. So I picked up my phone and called Ryan. Harper answered. Hi, Barbara, she said coolly. Ryan's in a meeting. Can I take a message? It's important, I replied. I need to speak with him about the mortgage. Pause. What about it? I'm on medical leave, I said carefully. I've been diagnosed with pneumonia, and I won't be able to pick up extra shifts. I was hoping you and Ryan could cover the payment just for a month or two while I recover. The silence stretched and stretched. Then, so, you're saying you're not sending the money this month? The tone. As if she were asking whether the garbage pickup had been delayed. Like this was a scheduled transaction, I was inconveniencing her by pausing. I'm sick, Harper, I said quietly. We're counting on that money, Barbara, she snapped. We've made plans. We already booked our Christmas trip to Aspen. Ryan's parents are flying in. There's a deposit. I sat in stunned silence. You have money for a ski vacation, but not your mortgage, she sighed. The sigh of someone being forced to speak slowly to the elderly. Don't be dramatic. You've been helping us for years. This is no different. No different. I had coughed blood into my tissue that morning. I gathered my breath. I've been paying your mortgage for 3 years, Harper. I think you can manage 1 month while I recover. She scoffed. Right. Because that makes up for everything Ryan did for you when Mark died. My heart actually stopped. What? He's told me everything, she said flatly. How he had to stay close to home because you couldn't function. How he sacrificed jobs, opportunities, his happiness, because you leaned on him so hard. That wasn't true. I had picked up every shift I could, made casseroles for his friends, paid tuition, until my hands shook writing the checks. He had insisted on staying nearby. You've rewritten history, I said. No, she snapped. I just see the whole picture. And frankly, Barbara, you've been helping financially because you want to feel needed. But don't use your health to manipulate us. I opened my mouth, closed it, swallowed air. Have Ryan call me, I managed. But he didn't call that night, or the next. 3 days later, he finally did. Mum, he said, all briskness and shallow sympathy. Harper told me you're sick. I'm sorry you're not feeling well, but we really need that payment. We've already committed to hosting a dinner for Harper's work. We ordered new dining chairs. I stared at the water stain on my ceiling. Ryan, I said slowly, I've paid your mortgage for 36 months. That's $3,186 times 36. That's over $125,000. While you redecorated, while you vacationed, while I skipped meals. He went quiet. So you're keeping track, he said eventually. I thought you were helping because you wanted to, not because you expected something in return. That hit me like a slap. All I expected, I said softly, was some basic respect. And maybe some concern for my health. "It's just bad timing, Mom," he said. There it was. The phrase that explained everything. Bad timing. As if pneumonia had RSVP'd wrong. As if my lungs hadn't gotten the holiday memo. I wanted to scream. Instead, I said, "Don't bother. I'll figure something out." And I did. The next morning, I stopped the automatic transfer. It felt like lighting a match in a locked room. Risky. Hot. But necessary. Then I called Grace. Grace Thompson, my old friend, had retired from teaching and spent her time hosting book clubs and volunteering at the community centre. For years, she'd been asking me to join. "Barbara Wilson," she said, voice warm. "To what do I owe this call? Is that book club invitation still open?" I asked. She laughed, delighted. Always. "We meet Thursdays at the library. But aren't you usually working then?" "Not anymore," I said. "I'm making some changes." The words felt strange in my mouth, like switching from winter boots to sandals too early in the season. But they also felt right. That afternoon, I brewed a fresh pot of tea, opened a book I hadn't touched in years, and sat in a silence I chose for once, not one forced upon me by neglect. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I might finally be learning to breathe again. You never really know how tangled you are in someone else's mess until you try to walk away from it. I learned that the Monday after Thanksgiving, when I visited my lawyer, Martin Goldstein had handled Mark's will years ago. I remembered his office as one of those safe-feeling spaces, warm lighting, coffee-scented upholstery, and a secretary who always offered you a mint, whether you wanted one or not. When I walked in, Martin rose from behind his desk. "Elaine," he said kindly, "it's been too long." "Too long," I agreed, easing into the leather chair. And also somehow not long enough. He waited patiently as I told him everything, how I'd been paying Ryan and Harper's mortgage for 3 years, how I'd withdrawn money from my retirement account, skipped home repairs, cancelled vacations, worked brutal overnight shifts, all to keep them in their dream house. How I'd finally stopped. And there was no written agreement, Martin asked Penn, tapping the side of his notepad. "No," I said. "It was all verbal. Ryan said they'd pay me back someday." Martin exhaled. "Then legally it could be considered a gift. Unless we can prove an implied contract." My stomach dropped. "So they could just walk away, forget everything." He nodded slowly. "Unless we can find any communication that suggests repayment, texts, emails, notes, you're in a grey area." I swallowed hard. "What are my options?" "Well, you could file a civil claim," he said. "But it would take time and money, and it would almost certainly sever your relationship with Ryan." I sat with that. The idea of suing my son made my skin crawl. It wasn't the money. It was the grief of being forced into a position where protecting myself looked like betrayal. "I don't want to take legal action," I said. "I just want to stop bleeding out." Martin nodded. "Then stop. You've already cancelled the transfers. Now document everything. Dates, amounts, context. If they ever come after you emotionally or legally, you'll be prepared." There was a pause. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. "Elaine, is your name on any of their financial accounts?" I blinked. "Well, yes. Last year I co-signed a home equity line of credit. Harper said they needed it for some renovations. She said it was mostly for adding insulation and energy-efficient windows." Martin's pen stopped tapping. "How much was the line of credit?" $50,000, I said quietly. He leaned back in his chair. "Elaine, you may be on the hook for that if they default." "I didn't think they'd use it," I whispered. I thought it was just in case. He handed me a piece of paper. "Go to the bank. Today, check the status. If they've drawn from it, and I suspect they have, you may want to pay it off yourself. It sounds backwards, but it might be the only way to protect your credit." I left his office feeling like I'd just walked out of a courtroom in my own head, both the defendant and the victim. At the bank, I gave the teller my ID and waited while she clicked around the screen. "The current balance on the line of credit," she said, "is $48,622. I stared at her. "How much?" $48,622, she repeated. "Looks like the last draw was for $12,000. November 15th. November 15th. Right before they told me I wasn't invited to Christmas. I stood very still, holding my breath, the way you do when your body is deciding whether to cry or scream. I'd like to pay it off, I said, voice barely audible, and close the account. The teller blinked. Ma'am, are you sure that's a significant amount? I'm sure, I said. Transfer from my retirement fund. It took nearly 2 hours. There were penalties, fees, conversations with supervisors. But by the time I left, the account was closed. That debt, it was mine now. But at least no one could use it to destroy my credit while pretending they were the victim. I went home to 3 missed calls from Ryan. A text that read, "Mortgage late notice came in. Call me ASAP." I didn't reply. Instead, I made tea and sat at my kitchen table with a notepad. I wrote down every payment I'd ever made on their behalf, every transfer, every promise, every betrayal disguised as a favor. Somewhere between the leaky faucet I never fixed and the dental work I'd postponed, I realized something simple and terrifying. I had traded decades of my life for someone else's illusion of stability, and I was done. That night, I received a message from Harper. Just 10 words. "You had no right to close that account without us." I stared at the screen, stunned by the audacity. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just outrage that I'd stepped out of line in a system they believed I existed to maintain. No response, just delete. The next morning, I called Dr. Marshall. "I'd like to discuss returning to work," I said. He hesitated. "Elaine, you're still recovering." "I know," I said, "but maybe not on the floor. Something lighter, administrative, daytime." He sounded relieved. "We can do that. 3 days a week. You'd be working with scheduling records. It's less money, but—" "That's fine," I interrupted. "It's enough. Because here's the thing, I didn't need more money. I needed more me. And for the first time in decades, I was ready to start building a life that didn't hinge on whether or not someone else needed me." 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail. Not a bill, not a holiday card. An actual letter, thick envelope, handwritten, return address, no logo. Inside was a note from my sister Judith. Judith and I hadn't spoken much in recent years. Not because of a falling out, but because life just drifts sometimes. She'd moved to Arizona for the dry weather and cheaper rent after her husband passed. We exchanged holiday cards, the occasional phone call. But that was it. The note was short, written in her tight, upright handwriting. "Elaine, by the time you read this, the paperwork will be finalized. I've been sick. I didn't want to make a fuss or have anyone feel sorry for me. But I also didn't want my life savings going to some foundation I never cared about. So I left it to someone who's done more giving than anyone I know. You always put everyone else first. Maybe now it's your turn. Check with the attorney listed below. It's all legitimate, no strings attached. Love, Judith." I didn't know whether to cry or scream. I read the letter 3 times before I even noticed the second sheet of paper, a copy of the transfer form. She had left me everything. Bank accounts, stocks, bonds, an old house she'd inherited from her in-laws. Total value, $7 million. $7 million. My knees buckled. I had to sit down, actually sit, because the numbers didn't compute. This was my sister who lived modestly, who wore the same shoes for a decade, who never once let on that she'd been quietly investing and saving. I laughed. Then I sobbed. Then I stared out the window and whispered, "What the hell do I do now?" Because here's the truth, I wasn't poor. Not anymore. Not technically. But I was still broken. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way. No swelling music, no collapse. Just the quiet damage of years spent erasing yourself, only to be reminded in a legal document that you still existed. I didn't tell anyone at first, not Ryan, not Harper, not even Grace. Instead, I sat with it. Let the idea stretch in my mind like a new pair of shoes, uncomfortable, unfamiliar, but full of potential. $7 million. I could have moved into a penthouse, flown to Italy, donated to every cause I'd ever loved. But you know what I did first? I bought a chair. Not just any chair, a real chair, sturdy, cushioned, with a wide seat and curved arms and fabric that felt like soft armor. I placed it by the window where the light hit around 10 a.m. and just sat. Cup of tea in hand, no noise, no bills, no demands, just me. The next day, Ryan showed up. He didn't call, just knocked holding a folder and wearing that anxious smile he used when he needed something. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping inside like nothing had happened. I watched him. He looked thinner, or maybe just more drawn, like life had stopped being filtered through Harper's curated Instagram lens and started hitting him in 1080p reality. "I brought the loan paperwork," he said, holding out the folder. "Harper and I talked. We want to start paying you back. I know it'll take time, but I didn't take it, Ryan," I said softly. "I'm not asking for repayment. That money's gone." He blinked. Then, "What do you want?" That stopped me, because for so long I hadn't let myself want anything. Not comfort, not peace, not even basic dignity. And now, standing in my own living room, with sunlight warming my knees and a bank account heavier than my regrets, I realized what I wanted. "I want to be more than a transaction to you," I said. "More than a mortgage payment, more than a backup plan. I want you to see me. Not the version of me that Harper tolerates. Me." He looked stunned, like the idea had never occurred to him. "Mom, I do see you." "No," I said, voice quiet but firm. "You see what I do for you? Not who I am?" We stood there, two people bound by history, but separated by years of unspoken expectations. Then I stepped back. "You don't owe me money," I said. "But you do owe me honesty. And maybe if you're willing a relationship that isn't built on guilt." He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "I can do that." "Good," I replied. "Because I've started building something new. And if you want to be part of it, you're welcome. But I'm not shrinking anymore to fit into your life." There was silence. Then he did something I didn't expect. He hugged me, tightly, like he'd just remembered who raised him. Like he'd finally seen the woman who'd given him everything, not out of obligation, but out of love. And maybe he was ready to give some of that back. I didn't tell him about the inheritance. Not then. Not because I wanted to hide it or hold it over him, but because I needed space. Space to feel what it meant to have something that was truly mine, unattached, unshared, unobligated. So, while Ryan slowly inched his way back toward me, not with requests, but with coffee visits, quiet check-ins, and even helping me fix that leaky faucet, I got to work designing the life I'd postponed for far too long. The first thing I did was sell the house, not out of anger, not as a final goodbye, but because the rooms had grown heavy with silence. Too many memories packed into the corners like old sweaters you don't wear but can't throw away. Every floorboard creaked with Mark's laugh. Every drawer held bits of a life that had once been bursting with purpose. I sold it to a young couple expecting their first child. Watching them walk through, pointing at the walls like they already belonged there, it made my heart ache in the best way. I took none of the furniture with me. Just a small box, a framed photo of Mark and me on our honeymoon, a pressed flower from Ryan's kindergarten art project, and a letter Judith had written me back in 1982 after I'd gotten my first job. Then I moved into a cottage. It wasn't grand, no lake views, no imported tile or wine fridge. Just a two-bedroom place with a deep front porch, creaky floorboards, and a garden that bloomed on its own terms. And it felt like heaven. I filled it with light things, light colours, light sounds, jazz in the morning, birdsong in the evening. I bought a second chair to match the one I'd splurged on the soft-armoured one, just in case someone came by. Then I got to work turning Judith's legacy into something more than a bank balance. I met with a financial planner, set up funds for my health, for travel, for rainy days, and for days where the rain came from somewhere inside. I made donations to the library, to the hospital's nursing scholarship program, to a women's shelter, where I started volunteering on Thursdays. And then one bright Tuesday in April, I took a trip. Not a cruise, not a retreat. A train ride. I boarded the Southwest Chief from Chicago to Santa Fe. Just me, a window seat, and a journal I hadn't written in since the Bush administration. I watched landscapes roll by rust-red canyons, sun-washed hills, long stretches of quiet that felt like someone had finally turned the volume down on my life. I wrote everything. About the nights I cried in silence after Mark died. About the meals I skipped so Ryan wouldn't go without. About Harper and the 1,000 little cuts disguised as compliments. About the moment I realized survival isn't the same as living. Somewhere near Kansas, I wrote one line and underlined it twice. I am not required to set myself on fire to keep others warm. When I got back, I found a letter waiting for me. This time from Ryan. Mom, I've been thinking a lot lately. About you, about Dad, about all the ways I've failed to understand how much you gave and how little I ever really asked about how you were doing. Harper and I are figuring things out. But I know now that I was hiding behind her confidence because I didn't have much of my own. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel invisible. I'd like to earn my way back into your life, not through repayment, but through presence. Also, I saw your garden on Facebook. If you ever need someone to help you plant those tomatoes, I'm available. And this time, I'm bringing the pie. Love, Ryan. I read it twice, then placed it in the box beside Judith's letter. He wasn't perfect, neither was I. But maybe finally we were starting from something real. That Sunday he came by. We sat in those matching chairs on the porch. No raised voices, no veiled guilt. Just two people peeling tomatoes and listening to cicadas hum in the trees. Can I ask you something, he said at one point. Sure. Where did all this strength come from? I smiled, slicing another tomato. It was always here, I said. I just finally decided to use it on me. I didn't expect Harper to show up. It was early June. The sun had just risen above the tree line, casting long, sleepy shadows across my porch. I had my hands in the soil, transplanting lavender into ceramic pots. My knees ached, my lower back was sending warning signals, but I smiled anyway, because pain feels different when it's earned. Then I saw the car pull up, sleek, black, still carrying that faint scent of entitlement. And out stepped Harper, clutching a canvas tote and looking like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. I stood slowly wiping my hands on a towel. She hesitated near the edge of the walkway, like the air itself was uncertain how to hold her. Harper, I said. Elaine. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, stripped of its usual shine. I didn't invite her in, but I didn't stop her either. She took a few steps forward, eyes scanning the porch, the flower beds, the wind chimes. It's beautiful here, she said finally. Thank you, I replied, letting the silence stretch. She looked down at her shoes, then back up at me. I'm not here to ask for anything, she said. I needed to say some things. I nodded, motioning toward one of the porch chairs. She sat. I sat. Two women older than we, admitted wearier than we showed, facing one another with nothing left to lose. Ryan told me about the inheritance, she said. I raised an eyebrow. I figured he would. She laughed, bitter but not cruel. I was furious at first, not because you didn't tell us, but because it made me realize how much I assumed you had nothing, that you were nothing outside of what you gave. I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the best answer when someone finally starts listening. I thought I was building this perfect life, she continued. The house, the parties, the image. But it was all so fragile, held up by your generosity and your silence. She swallowed hard. I came today because I'm tired of pretending. I was cruel, entitled, dismissive. I treated you like furniture. And you still helped us. You kept showing up. And I never once said thank you. Her voice cracked. She looked away. I'm saying it now. I studied her. The flawless hair was undone. Her nails chipped, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But the walls were down. And behind them was someone I didn't know, maybe never had. Thank you for saying that, I said. It matters. She nodded. Ryan's trying. I'm not sure what we are right now, but I think he's seeing things clearer. And I'm starting to, too. Then she pulled something from her tote, a small wooden box. She placed it on the table between us. This was your mother's, wasn't it? I blinked. It was a recipe box, carved oak worn smooth at the corners. I found it when we moved. I meant to give it back, but I kept it. I liked reading the little notes. She had a recipe for lemon cake with "add extra zest for Elaine's birthday" scribbled in the margin. I reached out, touched the lid. It felt like someone had handed me a missing piece of my childhood. "Thank you," I whispered. She stood straightening her coat. "I'll let you get back to your garden." She turned to go, then paused. "If you ever want company on one of your train trips, I'd like to come along. No strings. Just two women watching the country go by." I smiled, surprised at how much the idea didn't sting. "I'll think about it," I said. She nodded, then walked away. No dramatic exit, no parting line. Just quiet footsteps down a stone path. When she was gone, I opened the box. Inside were recipes, old photos, and a note in my mother's slanted handwriting. "Be generous, but not invisible. Loving others doesn't mean losing yourself. And always add extra zest." I laughed. Then I cried. Then I planted that lavender with a little more care than before. Because even broken things grow again with time, with space, and with just the right amount of sunlight. The morning of my 74th birthday started the way I'd always dreamed, but never dared ask for. No obligatory phone calls. No stiff brunch at some overpriced bistro where the menu had more adjectives than ingredients. Just silence, sunlight, and the smell of coffee filling my tiny kitchen. I made pancakes for myself, blueberry with real maple syrup. I set the table for one, but folded a cloth napkin anyway, just because it felt lovely to do so. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder who forgot. I didn't wait for permission to feel good, because I finally understood I was allowed to celebrate myself. A few hours later, I heard a knock. It was Grace's arms full of flowers, a homemade card sticking out of her tote, and a lemon cake with a single candle in the center. "Hope I'm not interrupting," she said with a grin. I nearly burst into tears. We sat on the porch and shared the cake with chipped plates and mismatched forks. At one point, she reached over and touched my wrist. "You look lighter," she said. "I feel it," I replied, like something finally loosened inside me. She nodded, then leaned in closer. "You know, the women at the community center, they've been talking. They want to start a monthly circle, a sort of storytelling group. Women over 60. Nothing fancy, just space to talk and be heard." "That sounds beautiful," I said. "They want you to lead it." I blinked. "Me?" Grace smiled. You've lived, you've endured, you've learned. You tell your truth in a way that lets other women breathe easier in their own skin." I looked down at my hands, veined, lined, strong. For most of my life, I'd used them to carry, to give, to lift others up. Maybe it was time they held something for me, or passed something on. "I'll do it," I said. And just like that, a new chapter began. That night, Ryan stopped by. He didn't bring a gift, just a card, a bag of my favorite loose-leaf tea, and something I hadn't expected: his presence. Unrushed, undemanding. We sat at the kitchen table, tea steaming between us. He cleared his throat. I got offered a new position. Local nonprofit. Lower pay, but more purpose. "That sounds good," I said. "You seem calmer." "I've been going to therapy," he added, eyes dropping, trying to untangle all of it. What I learned, what I passed on, what I blamed you for, that was never yours. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you," I said. He looked up, and in his eyes I saw not the boy I raised, not the man who once disappointed me, but someone finally meeting me adult to adult, human to human. "I know I have a lot to make up for," he said. "You don't owe me penance," I replied. "You owe me honesty, effort. That's enough." Later, after he left, I sat with a blanket over my lap, the moon hanging like a pearl above the trees. I opened my notebook, the one I'd started on the train ride months ago. On the next blank page, I wrote 74. Alone but never lonely. Broke the cycle. Built something better. Started late. Still blooming. Then I closed it and whispered into the quiet, "Happy birthday, Elaine." Because this year, for the first time in forever, I meant it. The first meeting of the storytelling circle was held in the small community centre room behind the library. The kind with folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, and that old carpet smell no amount of air freshener can fully erase. 7 women showed up. Some came with notebooks. Some came with nothing but tired eyes and quiet hands. All of them came with stories. There was Margaret, whose husband of 43 years had recently passed, leaving behind silence that roared in every room. There was Denise, who'd raised 3 kids solo, and never once stopped to ask herself what she wanted. There was Lynn, new to the neighbourhood, new to the country, clutching a journal like it was the last piece of home she had. They looked at me like I had something worth sharing. Like I wasn't just a woman who'd survived disappointment, but a woman who might know how to turn it into something useful. I started simple. I'm Elaine. I'm 74. I've made more casseroles than I've taken vacations. I've loved deeply and been let down just as hard. But I'm still here. And I want to listen and maybe tell you what I've learned. There was silence at first. Then a cough. Then Margaret cleared her throat and said I used to bake pies when I was angry. Everyone laughed. And just like that, the room softened. Words started to flow. Not polished, not rehearsed, but raw and honest and deeply human. It was the kind of space I'd wished for years ago. A place where your value didn't depend on your productivity or proximity to youth, but on your presence. Afterward, Grace pulled me aside. "You were born for this," she said. I smiled. Maybe I just finally arrived. That night, I walked home under a sky full of stars. No one called. No one needed money. No one expected me to fix anything. And I realized the silence I used to dread had become sacred. A place where I could actually hear myself. The next morning, I opened an email from Judith's attorney. The last piece of her estate had cleared a small farmhouse on a few acres outside Sedona. It had belonged to her late husband's family and had sat unused for years. Judith had kept it mostly out of sentiment. Now it was mine. And with it came a question I hadn't asked myself in decades. What if I moved? Not to run. Not to hide. But to start something entirely mine in a place not weighted by old memories or well-worn expectations. The idea sat in my chest like a warm stone, solid, grounding. I brought it up to Grace over lunch. She didn't flinch. "You deserve adventure," she said simply. "Even at my age, especially at your age." So I made a plan, not immediate, not impulsive, but real. I'd finish the season with the storytelling group. I'd pack what I needed, sell what I didn't. I'd visit the farmhouse in autumn, see if the bones were strong. And if they were, I'd build something new. A garden, a porch, maybe another circle of women who needed a place to be heard. I'd still see Ryan, still call Grace, still write my letters and bake my lemon cakes. But the rest, that would be entirely beautifully unwritten. And I couldn't wait to begin. By the time August rolled around, I'd begun calling the move my quiet rebellion. I didn't announce it on Facebook. I didn't send a mass email. I didn't even tell Ryan until I'd already booked the flight to Arizona and scheduled a visit with a local contractor. It wasn't about secrecy. It was about sovereignty. I didn't need a committee. I didn't want a jury. I had lived long enough to trust that when my heart whispered, "Go," I didn't need to wait for anyone to echo it. Ryan took it better than I expected. We were sitting in the shade of the back porch, my rental garden in full bloom behind us, the sun hanging low and golden. "You're moving," he said carefully. Eventually I said, "Not tomorrow, but yes. I want to see what it feels like to plant roots in a place where no one knows me yet, where I get to show up as I am, not as who I've always been to everyone else." He looked down at his iced tea, then back at me. "I think that's amazing." I raised an eyebrow. He smiled. "I mean it." You've spent most of your life building homes for other people. It's time you built one for yourself. I exhaled, deeply, gratefully. A week later, I boarded a plane with a canvas bag, a notebook, and a photo of Judith folded in my wallet. The moment I stepped off into the Sedona air dry warm, carrying hints of dust and desert flowers, I felt something shift. The farmhouse sat about 20 minutes outside town, down a long road, flanked by wild sagebrush and red clay. It was old, yes, but not broken. Weathered in the way strong women are worn on the surface steel underneath. The porch creaked as I stepped up. I stood there a long while, hand on the rusted screen door, imagining future mornings. Lemon tea, sunrise light, maybe even a dog. Inside the floors, moaned, but held. The walls were bare but generous. And in the back, fenced in by twisted iron and wild roses, was a garden that had long since been claimed by weeds. I smiled. Not for long, I whispered. The contractor arrived an hour later. A kind man named Miguel, with calloused hands and soft eyes. We walked the property together, making notes, trading ideas. He looked at me like I was someone with a vision, not just a little old lady with a checkbook. This place has good bones, he said. So do I replied. Over the next few days, I explored town, found a quiet cafe with outdoor seating and lemon bars that tasted like summer afternoons. I stumbled on a local bookstore that reminded me of the one where I worked in college, dusty shelves, overstuffed chairs, and an owner who remembered every name after one visit. I left a flyer on their bulletin board. The late bloomers circle women, 60 plus, gathering soon. To speak, to listen, to grow. Back at the farmhouse, I pulled on gloves and began clearing the garden. It was hard, satisfying work, ripping out weeds, unearthing old trellises, discovering tiny green shoots that had survived against all odds. One afternoon, as I rested in the dirt, sweat streaking down my temples, I thought of my mother, of the way she used to hum while gardening, of how she'd once said, "You can bury sorrow in the soil, and joy will still find a way up." And it had, in me. Later that evening, I opened my notebook again. I'm not starting over. I'm starting deeper, with roots that know what they need, and a heart that finally knows what it's worth. I closed the book and looked around. The air was still. The sky a perfect desert blue. The land didn't care about my past, my regrets, my name, or my resume. It only asked, "What will you plant here?" And I knew my answer. Everything that was ever mine to grow. Fall came slowly in Arizona, not with bold colors or frost-covered mornings like back home, but with a hush, a softening of the wind, shadows that stretched longer. The sun mellowed just enough to make sitting on the porch feel like prayer. By October, the farmhouse had begun to transform. The roof was new. The walls had fresh paint, pale cream, with blue trim Judith would have adored. The kitchen cabinets were still old, but repurposed, sanded down and stained to let the grain show. I kept the worn doorknobs, the creaky floorboard in the hallway, the chipped mirror in the bathroom. Some things I'd decided should stay imperfect. Miguel and his crew worked with care, and over those weeks I got to know his wife, his teenage daughter, and even his grandmother, who brought tamales on Saturdays and told me in halting English, "You have a calmer." That's good. People forget how to sit still. She was right, but I was learning again. The late bloomers circle had its first meeting under the cottonwood tree in my backyard. 8 women sat in mismatched chairs with mason jars of lemonade and notebooks filled with more life than some people live in 100 years. There was Carmen, who'd just divorced at 67 after decades of pretending she was fine. There was June, who lost her sister the year before and had no idea how to grieve out loud. There was Monica, who hadn't spoken to her son in 12 years, but had finally written the first line of a letter she might send. We laughed. We cried. We sat in silence when silence said more than words ever could. One night, after they'd all gone home, I found myself walking barefoot through the garden. The moon was high, casting soft light on the rows of kale and rosemary, and stubborn little zinnias still blooming in the heat. I knelt by the edge of the raised bed, ran my fingers through the soil, and whispered, "Thank you. To the earth. To Judith. To the woman I used to be who had no idea what would bloom once she stopped trying to survive and started trying to live." Then I went inside and checked my email. There was a message from Ryan. "Mom, I booked a flight. I want to come visit. No Harper, just me. I want to see what you've built. And if it's okay, I'd like to bring something I've written. A story. I think you'd be proud. Love, Ryan." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I finally did. He was coming not as someone who needed something, but as someone who wanted to see me. The real me. The me who'd stopped asking for permission to matter. I set the email aside, pulled out my journal, and wrote, "He's coming to my world now. Not to borrow, not to fix, not to explain. Just to witness. That's what love should be. Witnessing, without debt, without performance." I closed the book. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering the last of the dry leaves across the porch. I didn't sweep them away. They looked beautiful exactly where they were. Ryan arrived just after noon on a Saturday. I stood at the edge of the gravel drive as his rental car pulled in dust, curling behind the wheels like a slow exhale. He stepped out in jeans and a soft blue shirt I didn't recognize. No blazer, no phone in his hand. Just him and a brown leather satchel slung over his shoulder. For a second, we just looked at each other. Then he smiled. A real one. Not the practiced grin from family photos or tense holiday visits, but the kind of smile people wear when they're not trying to be anything but present. "Hey, Mom," he said, walking toward me. "Hey, kiddo." He pulled me into a hug. No rush, no apology, just warmth. I showed him the house, the garden, the writing circle's chairs tucked beneath the cottonwood tree. He walked slowly through each room, fingers grazing the walls like he was absorbing something sacred. "I get it now," he said at one point. This is yours. All of it." We spent the afternoon talking on the porch. About work, about therapy, about how he'd started journaling something he'd mocked me for back when he was 16 and allergic to vulnerability. At sunset, we ate the stew I'd made the night before, hearty and simple, and sipped mint tea as crickets sang in the distance. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a few folded pages. "I wrote something," he said. "It's not polished, but I wanted you to hear it first." I nodded. He read it aloud. It wasn't about me. Not exactly. It was about a woman named Elise who had spent her whole life giving only to discover one day that she had forgotten what it felt like to receive. It was tender, messy, full of longing and grace and regret and forgiveness. And when he finished, I had tears running down my cheeks. "Ryan," I whispered. "It's beautiful." He looked down, bashful. "I didn't know I had that in me," he said. "You always did," I replied. "You just needed space to find it." That night, he stayed in the guest room. Judith's old quilt folded at the foot of the bed, a small vase of rosemary on the nightstand. I lay awake for a while, listening to the soft creak of the house settling. The sound of someone else breathing under the same roof, not out of obligation, but choice. The next morning we went for a walk. The air was cool, dry, the sky wide and impossibly blue. He asked me what came next. "More of this," I said. "More writing, more quiet mornings, more circles with women who are finding their way back to themselves." He nodded, thoughtful. "You ever think about publishing your story?" he asked. I smiled. "Sometimes. But I don't need a big audience. I just need to know I told it." He reached for my hand as we walked. Didn't say anything, just held it. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in years, not satisfaction, not pride, but peace. Because I had made it through the fire, through the silence, through the erasure. And on the other side, I found myself, not in spite of what I'd lost, but because I finally stopped giving it all away. Spring returned to the desert in soft, deliberate ways, not with the urgency of northern seasons, but like a woman who knows her worth, unhurried, unapologetic, arriving on her own time. By April, the garden behind my little farmhouse was alive again. The rosemary had tripled in size. Lavender buzzed with bees. A single tomato vine, stubborn as I was, climbed the trellis with quiet determination. The late bloomers' circle had grown too. We now had 12 women, some regulars, some drifting in and out like seasons. The cottonwood tree had become more than a backdrop. It was a witness. To heartbreak, to laughter, to the slow rebuilding of forgotten selves. One Thursday, as the women packed up their notebooks and hugged their goodbyes, Carmen lingered behind. "I've been thinking," she said. "What if we published these stories?" I blinked. Published. She nodded. Not for fame, not for profit, just to leave something behind. Something true. Something ours. The idea sat in my chest like a candle, small, steady. "Let's do it," I said. That night, I pulled out my journal and began again. Only this time I didn't write about the pain. I wrote about the after, about mornings with no alarms, about tea that never went cold, about the sound of a porch swing creaking under the weight of two people who finally learned how to speak softly, about Ryan visiting once a month, sharing updates on his non-profit work, and reading new drafts of his short stories aloud as I sipped wine and smiled into the dusk, about Harper, who now lived 3 towns over, and sometimes sent postcards, short, unflowery ones, with sketches in the margins, and notes, like I'm learning to listen to silence, and I'm not angry anymore. Thank you for planting the seed. About the letter I wrote but never sent to Mark. Telling him I forgave him for dying too early, for leaving me to figure out the world without a partner, for trusting I'd eventually find a way back to myself. And about Judith, whose quiet fortune gave me the chance to finally claim something I never had. Freedom. Freedom from guilt, from erasure, from carrying the weight of everyone else's life on my back until I couldn't feel my own heartbeat. On the anniversary of my move, I hosted a dinner in the backyard. String lights, fold-out tables, mismatched plates, a potluck of dishes that tasted like love in all its many dialects. Grace was there, laughing louder than anyone. Ryan read one of his stories. Carmen brought her new partner. Harper didn't come, but she sent a lemon cake with a note that said, "Extra zest, always." When the night ended and the dishes were rinsed and the candles snuffed out, I sat alone on the porch and looked up at the stars. And for the first time in my life, not as a mother, not as a wife, not as a nurse or a provider or a giver, just as Elaine, I said aloud I did it. Not perfectly, not quickly, not without grief, but I did it. I became the woman I was meant to be, and she was enough.